I started in collections. My technical work was mostly like helping people fix their iPads, helping people fix their phones. I was a cataloger off the side of my desk for about 4 years. I did enough to know that I don't like cataloging or back-end ILS work. I technically got a 20% release from my collections duties to work on the migration, but that work didn't get handed off to anybody. So it was still my problem. I just had less time to do it. And I mean, we're all in collections here, presumably. Last year was really challenging. It's also worth mentioning that we didn't just do an ILS migration. We also migrated from Easy Proxy to Open Athens. I led probably most of that work on our end. I'm going to try to avoid discussing Open Athens because Sheldon Armstrong gave a presentation about that last December about UBC's migration. I don't really want to recover ground. This is just kind of a disclaimer that because I was working on Folio and OA at the same time, they're really closely linked in my mind. And it was also kind of like just a lot of work that contributed to a high level of stress. So I was pretty anxious about this migration, and I think I was right to be. I don't really want to just like sit here and gripe, but I don't think it's helpful to pretend like everything was wonderful and I had fun. I accept that sometimes our jobs kind of suck. I know I'm not the only person that's been expected to do the work of multiple positions and the time it takes to do one. You end up really busy, you have no margin for error, and the pressure kind of becomes a lot as things start to go wrong, especially things that you have no control over. So professionally, for me, that was like budget cuts, the exchange rate tanking, which kind of threw like all of my budget planning into utter chaos. And personally, if you have talked to me at any point in the last 8 months, my problems with daycare illnesses, they laid me out for like all of fall and winter. My kids just like wouldn't keep their hands out of their mouths. So anyways, I just mentioned that because I can't really separate this project from the broader circumstances that it happened under. And there's not really a way for me to be like objective about everything. If, yeah. My coping mechanisms got a lot of mileage. I went a bit stir crazy and ended up like biking or walking or skiing like every day from September to mid-May. Usually I decompress by listening to an audiobook alone in the woods. Even when I was really sick, the consistent breaks and the effort really helped me. So if you're going through a big project like this, think about what you like and do it and don't make exceptions. So if you're unfamiliar with Folio, it's an open source ILS. This is a bad screenshot of what our version looks like. My dashboard is completely bare bones. The widgets I didn't think were super helpful, but whatever, maybe I'll find good ones later. I always thought of open source as kind of having like a DIY connotation. There's like a team of core developers turning out software features for their project just because they're angry at like commercial choices or they're obsessive or they're trying to build a resume or something. They publish their code with the expectation that institutions or individuals will take their software and then customize it for what they need. I don't know how many libraries in Canada are actually using Folio like that. I think some of the Ivies in the US might be, presumably because they have or had access to IT resources. At TRU, we have 3 librarians who do technical work, the systems librarian, a web librarian, and myself. For this migration, it was just the systems librarian and myself doing the bulk of the technical work. So our capacity for making customization to suit our institution is pretty much non-existent. So we paid EBSCO a bunch of money to facilitate this whole process. Yeah, with all that said, I like Folio. It's reasonably intuitive. It's well documented. We moved over to it from Cersei Dynix's workflows, which, if you've never used it, is a labyrinthine hellscape. We had apparently been on it since 1997, I think. And having used the UI, I suspect little has changed in that time. I think our last major upgrade was like 2010 or something. So on my end of the migration, the work has mostly just been tedious. The modules that support acquisitions and collections management aren't too difficult to comprehend, especially if you're at a library that uses EDS and you're familiar with the holdings manager. That cuts down on the learning curve, at least if you have an EBSCO managed instance of Folio. So Folio can do a lot of things, but as the functions get more complex, there's generally an equivalent amount of data entry required to unlock those features. All the different apps in it are connected. It's kind of like blurs the lines between ERM and acquisitions and reporting, but they need to be set up first. So ensuring that all of that happens. You have to do like a lot of redundant entry. So here's kind of an example of what I mean via terrible screenshots. This is our agreements app. I don't expect anyone to make sense of this in like 3 seconds. Don't worry about it. There's barely any information here. It's just the title, the term start date, and the status. This kind of acts as like a central record for a vendor or a resource that connects to all the other apps. So there's an organizations app. Use that for things like storing administrator credentials. So that's what this is. And I have not made them visible for obvious reasons. So when you put data into one, it doesn't automatically populate the other. You have to go in and make all of the records, and then you can connect the two, which leads you to something like this. So this is the agreement. I don't know if you can see my cursor. The agreement's at the top. And then there is the organizations thing at the bottom. So it's connecting the different apps. I was initially confused why this was good. It seemed like a lot of work, but it's mostly there to provide flexibility. Eventually you end up with like a very information-rich record that's all located in the same place. Like you're always going back to this agreements app. But you have to do your entry in a million different places. So the setup is labor intensive. It's not difficult. I see the same thing goes for like Open Athens. It's a lot of emailing vendors and testing and troubleshooting. Everything's like well documented, but it takes time to reference. And language kind of changes between systems. So like what a word means in workflows, for example, doesn't mean the same thing in Folio, which I just more time spent trying to spot the synonym. So all this work was just time consuming, not necessarily difficult. There's a bunch of stuff that I chose not to migrate. I'm not tracking our finances in Folio, for example. So our budget isn't $5,000. This is just like a test. There are benefits like automatically populating cost per use calculations and panorama interactions. So panorama is EBSCO's analytics software, but after you've done the requisite setup. So I've already got all of my spreadsheets set up, and I think that's probably adequate for tracking our finances. I can see all of my inputs, my formulas are easy to check on. I don't need to fiddle with settings to make sure everything's displaying correctly. Folio outputs CSV files. I couldn't really see the point of doing a ton of data entry if I'm just going to dump everything from Folio into a spreadsheet anyways to analyze everything. And that was kind of one of the issues I kept coming up against while I was working on this. I developed a lot of ways of having to avoid using workflows, and it was a tough sell ditching those methods. So I had to migrate our ERM data because people need access to it. I'm rebuilding our ordering records and our fund structure because 3 decades of entropy created a massive amount of junk data, but we need it for our physical ordering. I had to migrate our license data because the terms need to be accessible, but I didn't feel compelled to do that with basically like everything else that I work on. Which is probably a good segue to discuss some of my points of discomfort. Okay. We're moving in the direction of locating basically all of our systems and content remotely. Folio seems to be the latest expression of that end goal. We're most of the way there. I'm partially driving that with how I'm doing acquisitions, mainly for access and usage reasons, even though I'm extremely uncomfortable with the ephemerality of licensed digital content, including like perpetually licensed ebooks, stuff like that. Almost the entire software side of our operations are remote now. So we've got about 12,000 things hosted locally, another low 6-figure sum to represent our physical collection. By contrast, we have about 300 million things indexed in our catalog, give or take. That all lives offsite on the hard drive of the company that sold it to us. We get access typically with a layer of DRM wrapped around it. And that gives us with about 0.1% of direct control over our collection. So I was at BCLA a few weeks ago, and one of the sessions, I think it was on cataloging, had the classic, why does OCLC keep including offensive subject headings in their records? I think that's come up at almost every Canadian conference that I've been to when there's like a cataloging session. And it's a problem for us too. We primarily manage our collection through the holdings manager, EBSCO's holding manager, rather than loading records. So we don't have much control over the metadata in our catalog. So we've done a big decolonization push, but it's for our physical materials. And I'm still getting about 1,600 results when I plug like the Indians of North America into a subject heading search. And a lot of that's coming from holdings manager collections. A lot of it's coming from OCLC records that got loaded directly into the catalog. Yeah, so we're also limited in the ways that we can customize our front end. I'm not sure if anyone here has had success getting EBSCO to build custom filters or change the default filters. We got kind of a bland, this is what our user testing indicated was preferable, but no references to the user testing, no info about who they tested, the sample size, the methodology. Sorry, and this is in reference to EDS. And I think Folio kind of accelerates all of these problems. So we were warned away from adding large batches of records because Folio doesn't have a reliable way to do mass deletions, only mass suppression. I'm not really sure how truthful that is. That seems like kind of a core ILS function, like deleting a ton of records. I looked at the terms in our contract and it didn't look like they included tiered pricing that's tied to our storage size. So I'm reasonably sure we pay the same if we've got a gig of data stored on their end or a petabyte of data. So my conspiracy theory is that they don't want us to exploit that lack of a term, but that's not confirmed. So it was recommended that we set up custom collections instead of batch loading. So the custom collections are held by EBSCO on an FTP server that we upload all of our record batches to. We optionally could have had publishers send records directly to EBSCO, and their technicians would do all of the work to make it visible. I chose to draw a line there, which was internally contentious because we have less than half an FTE of a technician assigned to cataloging. I would like to see our metadata decolonized to the greatest possible degree. So I set up a process where we can at least still catalog it, then upload it to that server. But we had an option where stuff would just get sent straight in and we'd have no control over how it looked in the end, which I thought was problematic, but it would have saved us time. It was also recommended that we turn to EBSCO support for setting up new databases with Open Athens rather than reaching out ourselves. Again, it was attractive. It's one less task I would have to do when I buy something new. But I didn't want to voluntarily surrender an important task to EBSCO and increase our reliance on them. So we went with like a cloud solution for reliability reasons, but I kind of think it's a liability for anyone involved in collections work. You know, we store all of our content, all of our systems on servers owned by the corporations we're buying content from. And simultaneously, we're relying on their technical expertise while we let those functions atrophy within the library. And we voluntarily agreed to add this like huge switching cost to our systems, which kind of lock us into the decision of hanging onto this ILS, even if it turns out to be a bad fit. And I'm uncomfortable with the idea that we just keep handing more and more and more control over to these corporations. And in the long run, it keeps going poorly for libraries. And I can't help but feel that this migration was kind of our like ultimate sacrifice to that end. I just don't know how to negotiate with a business that holds all of our data, the access to that data, a large proportions of the publications we want, the storefront that we use to publish things, we buy stuff, or that we use to purchase things, we buy stuff through Gobi, and who are apparently employing technicians who support our systems. You know, it feels like we're living in a company town, sort of. I've talked about this before, and these are some points that I really like to emphasize in presentations like this. They're a huge pet peeve of mine. We contracted with EBSCO to support this migration, and I want to be explicit that they didn't help us. They provided a service that we paid for. I've noticed this at conferences, in our internal communications. The language being used to describe a relationship with the vendor makes it seem like they're kind of like voluntarily giving us their expertise, you know, to support a Canadian library, something like that. But they're compensated for their support. And I think we should reject making obeisance. Their service was useful, but the support contract, even though it was only a September to June term, was equivalent to the annual salary of a librarian. And we're going to continue to pay them for various services related to the ILS, like hosting our Folio instance or paying them to pay Amazon Web Services to host that data. And the total cost is like 6% of our total e-resources budget. And I don't want to say we couldn't have done it without EBSCO. You know, maybe if we hadn't critically outsourced all of our critical IT functions to vendors over the last 3 decades, because we're living in a society that devalues institutions that do work for public good. rather than profit-seeking motives, we'd be in a better position to lead this work ourselves. But here we are. The other problem here that I thought of is that this relationship only goes one way. If my institution ceases to exist, EBSCO carries on. If EBSCO stops selling us a product or sharply increases prices, our dependence on them makes their business decisions an existential threat. They're benign right now, but what happens if they get new leadership or come under new ownership? We're really dependent on them, and we've kind of done this to ourselves voluntarily. We've also kind of handed over the power to make meaningful changes to our system now. So this ILS can essentially be changed to suit our needs, but we've outsourced the capacity to make those changes to EBSCO. So we're seeing this with EDS. A chorus of libraries can voice outrage. Some change happens, but we're like a year out from the initial announcement, and the positive changes have more often been revisions, and the speed that those get rolled out is pretty glacial. And I'm afraid that we just signed up for that. So our back end and the front end get to change based on like opaque decision making that's completely external. So again, I like Folio. It does everything Circe's workflows did. It's easier to navigate. It's more intuitive. We needed to change our ILS. Like, it was completely necessary. I just feel like we're getting more deeply ensnared in our Faustian bargain with software companies. I realize that the price per byte of data stored on a server and managed by Amazon is probably at like the lowest point it ever has been. And it's a hard sell trying to convince people that it's worthwhile to create their own infrastructure and build expertise and self-host, especially when the initial costs look really high. But like, contracting the work out was the only option that we considered, as if it was the only way to move forward. And it isn't. It's just the path of initial least resistance. So as far as I know, we never had a discussion about what we do with our data in this context. As long as vendors are compliant with BC's privacy law, that seems adequate, like at a departmental level. But this is a major operational decision that has ramifications that can ripple out over many years. So, if EBSCO is fixing our problems, we probably need fewer people with technical expertise, but we become codependent. When we're measuring the lifespan of our ILS in decades, 25 years, we just ditched our 30-year contract with Circe. So 25 years might not be unrealistic. At 3% annual inflation, the price doubles over that 25-year span. In the last 5 years, we've had a 1% increase to our budget. So even if we shift money from our salary savings, because we need fewer technical staff, we're not going to be able to keep pace with those like inflationary increases. And we've never really discussed the externalities of hosting offsite with a vendor like EBSCO. There's climate implications. Data centers use a huge amount of electricity, which exacerbates climate change. Kamloops is constantly under threat of wildfires. Like, the last 8 years that I've lived here, I've seen maybe a dozen that were like kind of apocalyptic. And with like cloud storage, we're protected from local events like power outages or caused by wildfires or server maintenance. But the data center infrastructure is very centralized. So with AWS, Western Canada is served by one data center in Airdrie, I think. So, natural disasters could damage that location or the networks that sprawl out of it. And this is all kind of a like negative feedback loop. So even though I'm satisfied with the outcome of this project, provided the scope of that satisfaction is just kind of limited to like how the software works and our immediate needs, I'm having trouble pushing down my uncertainty and ignoring all the other times that outsourcing has caused pain. Everything's probably going to be fine, but I can't help but feel like we're accumulating liability. Yeah. And are there any questions or comments, not questions? I'm going to stop sharing.
Thanks, Joey. It's really great, and so many things you brought up. Recording too.